Hey everybody, welcome back to the next segment of the 305 engine build. Today I'm going to walk you through the rebuilding of the cylinder heads. If you remember right, last time we got all the way up and through the short block assembly of the engine. Now we're going to start to assemble the upper end and draw some of this stuff together. I appreciate you watching this, so without any further delay, let's get started.
We've got the heads cleaned up. We ran them through the vat and the jet wash machine. Although they're not final cleaned yet, we just got all the initial oil and grease and sludge and stuff off of them. They were pretty clean. They weren't that bad. So now the next step is we have to disassemble these heads. And so I want to I'm not going to walk you through every single aspect of disassembly, but I want to kind of show you on this first head here some of the things that we do. Now, one thing we're concerned about on the cylinder heads is are the valves seating or sealing. One of the little tricks you can do on this is to leave the valves and the spark plugs and everything in, and then just fill these combustion chambers up with water, with solvent or liquid or whatever. And we did that. I put the head level so that I could actually fill this chamber up with liquid. And I let it sit there for, I don't know, probably 45 minutes. And what I was looking for is I was looking to see if there was any leakage into these ports here. And I was pleasantly surprised to find out that I had absolutely no leakage whatsoever past these valves. Now, that's really not the official way to check these things to make sure the valves are leaking. You need to vacuum test the ports and all that stuff. I'm not going to get that far into it because I'm planning on doing a valve job. We're going to pull these out and we're going to cut the seats and valves and so forth and redo the valve job. But it is kind of a good indicator as to the condition of the head. In other words, if you put water in here and it comes gushing down into this port, well, you probably got a really serious, valve or seat problem here. But these seem like they're sealed up pretty good. So these heads are probably in good shape. So let's get these apart and we'll start taking a look at some of these parts. So one of the things you want to do, one of the good practices that we do to help get this thing apart is just take a deep socket. And we're going to put it right over the keeper like so, and then we're going to take a hammer and we're going to smack on that. Now, here's the thing. You don't want to have the head sitting flat on the bench when you do that, because if you smack it too hard, you'll push the valve head down against the bench and you could bend the valve. So I always take something, just whatever I can find, and I'm going to just put it under one side of the head so the head's not sitting flat on the bench. And then we're going to take a hammer. This is just a dead blow. And I'm just going to take my hammer and I'm just going to smack these. And what that does for me is it loosens up those keepers if they happen to be tight. Then we take our spring compressor. We have the pneumatic one here. And we're just going to compress those. They compress and come off pretty easy. And we're going to take these off one at a time. There's your keepers. Now, on the valve train components themselves, it is always a good practice to keep these components in order. We don't want to mix any of these up. Even though I know we're doing a valve job, a lot of these components are considered what we call wear-mated. And so we want to keep them in order. That way we don't have any problems. What can happen a lot of times with wear-mated parts is that if you mix them up, they'll run okay, but the valve train can be kind of noisy because there's different wear patterns on different valves and valve guides and so forth, and it can cause the valve train to be noisy, and it can cause premature failure. So we want to keep all this in order. Now in these heads, everything's pretty much going to be new. So even though that's true, it's always a good practice to keep everything in order. And we're going to remove these valves one by one. You want to get your valve stem seals off of there. Of course, we're gonna add new valve stem seals in here, and then we're just gonna pull our valves out one at a time, and we're going to keep them in order with their respective guide, because we're going to need to check the valve and the guide clearance. That's something that can become an issue on some of these older heads, especially as we have worn out valve guides. Now, here's one thing that I would make a note of. What happens a lot of times is you get a lot of carbon buildup. You can see all the buildup on there. There's two reasons for that, two possible reasons. One of them is the horrific fuel that we have in this country. Their gasoline, if you buy cheap gasoline or low quality gas, it can do that. That can also be oil getting past the rings and burning in here, or it can be a valve guide that's letting oil down. The oil gets in here, superheats, and all the carbon builds up on the valve. So since this is an intake valve and the exhaust valve looks pretty clean, I'm leaning toward this is probably poor quality fuel here that's causing this, but we'll have to check all these parts out and find out. And you'll notice on this head, as I lean it over, we have these shims coming off of here. That's a big indicator that this head has already had a valve job done on it before, because these shims are not factory. These are actually shims that they put in there to make up the difference after they cut the seat in the valve, just to get the spring height right. So those are definitely aftermarket rebuilder shims that they're on here. So these heads have been done before. Okay, so now at this point we want to start taking a look at our seats. And these really, this is not oil you see on here, it's actually solvent. I had these in the solvent tank to try and degrease them a little better. So we want to take a good look at our valve seats. Now, one of the issues that we run into on these older heads is this smaller seat here. This is the exhaust seat. Well, the exhaust seat is really not conducive to unleaded fuel. Back in the day when we had leaded gasoline, they actually had a seat in here that was machined right out of the metal of the cylinder head, and it was soft. It was the same material as this cast iron. They did that because they knew that the lead that was in the gasoline was going to leave a deposit on here, and it actually protected these seats. Well, what happens over time when you start running unleaded fuel, the lead deposit that formerly was protecting this exhaust seat is not there. This causes a problem. What actually happens is it causes the valve to literally hammer the seat into the head, and the cast iron seats, because they're soft, they start sinking into the head. So in order to correct that, when we rebuild these heads, we actually machine this out and put a hardened seat in there. Now, here's the other thing. These heads have been rebuilt, and they may have seats in them already. They're just too dirty right now for me to be able to establish or tell that. But once I get them cleaned up some more and wire brush some of the carbon and stuff out of here, we'll be able to determine whether or not there's actually a seat inside here. To me, just my initial inspection of this, it actually looks like they've put a hardened seat in here already. It looks like these do look like seats to me, but we'll find out. So the seats look really good. They definitely look rebuildable. We don't have any obvious damage. Of course, we're going to have to, again, clean these up much better and then magnaflux the head, and I'll walk you through that to make sure that there's no cracks here. One of the other things that we need to look at is our valve guides. Now, what can give you a good indication of a bad valve guide is if you have a lot of movement. What you want to do is you want to put your valve down in that guide, and we want to look and see if we have excessive movement. We can actually check how much movement we have with a dial indicator. So what we do is we put a dial indicator up next to the valve, and we just let the dial indicator stylus rest on the edge of the valve, and then we move this valve back and forth to see how much movement we've got. Now, the amount of movement we have, we're only going to have half that much wear in here because it's moving that way and this way, and guides have a tendency to wear out in an hourglass shape. But I can tell you this right now. The amount of movement that I have here is about 12 thousandths. So that means I have about six-ish thousandths wear on that guide. Well, that's way too much. So obviously we're going to have to put valve guides in these heads. So that's one of the operations we're going to do. Now I'm going to go through and check them all, but usually when you have one valve guide that has that much movement in it, which is a lot, and I can tell just by feeling it. I've been doing this long enough. I can pull this valve up and I can feel the movement here. It's excessive. So we definitely are going to have to replace and put new valve guides. If you don't replace the valve guides, for those of you who are not completely familiar with what the valve guide is, the valve guide is literally the hole bored in the head where the valve goes in. It actually guides the valve into the head. So those are your valve guides, and we definitely got excessive movement here. So we're going to have to, since this is an integrated or an integral valve guide, and what that means is, again, back in the old days, they didn't put a guide insert in here. This guide is actually part of the metal of the head. So what we have to do is we have to go in and bore that out and press a new insert in there, and we're going to do all that on camera. I'm going to show you how to do that. So we know for sure that we need valve guides. I think we're good on our seats, our hardened seats, because it looks like they put seats in this. And of course we need a valve job, which means recutting the valves and cutting the seats, of course. Okay, so you may have heard the term magnafluxing, crack detection magnafluxing. This is what we call an electromagnet, and we call it that because it's a big, giant electrical magnet. And what it does, it has these fingers here, these arms, and we lay this across the chamber and we magnetize the head. You can see if I grab something metal here and I hit the button, this thing is magnetizing that. It's grabbing that. And if I let go of the button, so that button there is magnetizing this. So I am actually magnetizing that area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my fingers on my magnet. It's a very powerful magnet. I'm going to run it across diagonally, and then I'm going to take this little container here full of, it has little tiny iron filings or magnetic powder in it, and we're just going to sprinkle that powder over this area. And what happens is if there is a crack here in this area, the magnetic field is going to pull the powder into the crack and it shows up. And I've done that. I've got magnetic powder all over it and there's no crack showing. So had there been a crack here, it would have shown up. Now, one of the things that you have to do is if the crack is in line with the magnetic field, it won't show up. So that's why we go diagonally this way, and then we take another check and we magnetize it diagonally the other way, and of course we put some more powder on there, and I don't see any cracks on that head. So I won't insult your intelligence by making you watch me do every one of them, but needless to say, we're going to magnaflux all these. This is one of the first steps you do. It's called crack detection, and we also are going to flip it over and we're going to magnetize the top side, and then of course the sides of the head here. We're going to magnaflux the whole thing, make sure we don't have any cracks, because if you have a crack in a cylinder head, the whole job stops right there. You don't work on a head with a crack in it because it's basically junk. So we've got these heads cleaned up a little better now. One of the things that we did is we blasted them, and you can see we got them down to the bare metal. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a couple of things here simultaneously. We have our cylinder head, our rotary broach machine. This is a milling machine. We're going to go ahead and resurface the decks of these heads. And while that is surfacing, and I'll show you here in a minute how we set that up. While that is surfacing, we've taken the other head and we've got the other head up on this is a seat and guide machine. Now, one of the things that One of the good things about this is, like I said earlier, I suspected that there was hardened seats in these, and there indeed is. The exhaust seat actually has an insert that's pressed into it. So somebody has already machined these heads and put hardened seats in here. But like I said earlier, you know, the valve guides are loose, and so we're going to have to put guides in them. And that's why we've got it on this machine here. So we'll go through the guide installation process here in a minute. But first, I want to set the other head up on the milling machine and show you how we resurface that deck and make it nice and flat. So this is our rotary broach milling machine. It has a flat table, and this table it traverses like this. We have these arms up here that are going to grab onto the cylinder head. So we're going to lay our head flat on here and then just put shims under it to set it up. Of that broach, the cutting head is down below the surface here. We've lowered it down so that we're not going to hit the tooling or anything. And then we're just going to take our head and we're going to set it up, shim it, and clamp it into these arms here. Okay, so now we've got our head set up, we've got it perfectly level, we shimmed it a little bit so that this table you can see it can traverse freely under there. It's clamped into place, it's square, and we're going to mill it. Alright, so as you can see, we've got the head squared up, we touched off on both ends, it's perfectly level. And this machine runs on its own. We don't have to stand here and babysit it. And what this does is you set the feed, and this table just feeds underneath. You can see it moving, and it just shaves the bottom of that head. Every pass we take, we turn this in and we take off. This has increments of 1/1000ths on it. We take off a little bit more. We're pretty user friendly with this machine. I only like to take off about 1 thou at a time. So we'll let that run. Let's go back over to the seat and guide machine, and I'll show you how we set that up. So we have a pilot that goes into the hole, and it's tapered, and then we level the head with this precision level because the guides have to be perfectly level to the machine here. So we're going to take our tapered pilot, put it in, we're going to put our level on there, and then we're going to level this table. So once our cylinder head is perfectly level here to the machine, then we lock the table in place and we can go ahead and start boring those out for our guides. Okay, now that the head's level, we take another tool called a core drill. It has a pilot, and then it has a larger shank here that's going to bore that existing guide out, because if you remember right, we talked about the fact that this head has integral guides, or they're actually part of the cylinder head, and so we have to bore them out and put an insert in there. So we got our core drill in there, and you can see that this pilot's right into that hole, and then we turn the machine on and we just start boring that right out of there. So you can see we've got it bored out, and then we just take our guide inserts with a driver, and we're gonna press these in, and voila, we've replaced the guides. So we'll go ahead and do all that, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay guys, so we got the guides in. Now another thing I wanted to point out here, and this is something that you can have a machine shop do, we trimmed the top of the guides down. If you take a look at this other head here, you'll notice that the guide bosses on here are really big and thick, and actually the original valve stem seals on these heads was just an O-ring seal. It was this little O-ring that actually fit onto a groove right there. If you look at that's the keeper groove up there, and then there was an O-ring that went on the second. That was the only seal that was on here. Well, they had taken and they had stuck some of these seals on here, whoever rebuilt these heads. This is an umbrella seal, and it didn't really fit right. It wasn't, I mean, it's a common upgrade for these, but these didn't really fit good on here, and it just wasn't a good fit. Typically, when you put an umbrella seal on like this, you have to cut the bosses down like. So we went ahead and took our cutter and we cut these down, and now these seals are going to fit real nice, and you can actually put a positive seal on here if you want to. We're not going to do that. But that's a real good upgrade. It gives you the opportunity to put a much better valve stem seal on here, and also it's located correctly. It's not stuffed over that big fat guide boss. Okay, so we've got the guides in this head. This is the head that was up on the machine over there, and of course we still have we went ahead and milled the first head while we were working on that, and it's finished. We're going to pull that off of there. But what I did is I went ahead and cut the seats. I didn't really do a tutorial on camera of the valve job. I have another video. In fact, I have several videos. I have one video I did a few years ago where I walk through the entire seat installation and the guide installation and how to set up the cutters and everything. I didn't want to be redundant on that, so if you want to, you can go back and watch that and see just exactly how we do the valve job. But we grind the valves on that's a valve grinder right there. Now what's interesting about this V6 305 is the exhaust valves have a 45-degree seat angle on them, just like pretty much every other head out there nowadays. It's really common. But sometimes on the older engines, they actually had a different seat angle here. They had a 30-degree seat angle, so you can see the difference there. The intakes on this were actually 30 degrees, so we cut the intake seats and the intake valves at 30 degrees, and that gave us and I'm hitting that manifold down there. That gave us our seat angle there, which is 30 degrees. So sometimes you'll have a different angle on the intake and exhaust. One thing that I do know that in flow tests on big block Chevys, a 30-degree intake seat actually allowed them to put a larger valve in without shrouding the valve so much. So maybe there's something to that. Another thing about these heads that I wanted to point out is this. Now, if you're familiar with the LS series of heads on the Chevrolet, they have what they call a cathedral port. It's just a really tall port. And I was noticing that the ports on these 305 heads are very similar to the LS heads. They're very, very tall cathedral type ports. Well, the taller the port, the more velocity you have up top going in, and it actually makes for a really good flowing head. If you compare the height of those ports to a small block Chevy, these are way taller. These are very similar to an LS head in height. So I thought that was pretty cool. I thought that was interesting. So we'll get this head off and we'll take a look at this surface here. I'll show it to you. Okay, so there's your milled cylinder head. That is the finished product. And I can tell you this, I had to take off about 11 thousandths on this thing. These heads were definitely warped. I had to take off about 11 thousandths. When I checked it with a straight edge, I was pulling about 8 or 9 thousandths warpage. So this engine had definitely been overheated and hot because these heads were warped. But you can see we've corrected that and we got this nice smooth finish. Of course, we have to do the guides in this head as well, and then cut the seats. And then while we're doing that, we're going to set this head up on the mill and go ahead and resurface this one. And once we get that done, we're going to flip-flop. We'll put this head over on the guide machine, and we'll put this one on the surfacing machine. And once we get that done, these things will be ready for final wash and assembly. Okay, so now we come to the assembly of the cylinder heads. We've got our guides in, our seats are machined. We've got our valves freshly recut and reconditioned, ready to go. We got real good guide clearances here. If you remember earlier, the guides were very loose. Now they're nice and snug. We got about 1.5 thousandths clearance on the intake guide and about 2 thousandths on the exhaust. You need a little more on the exhaust because they're a lot hotter. So that's right within specs. Another thing we need to look at is our valve springs. So we took our valve springs and we tested them on the valve spring tester, and we didn't replace the springs on this because the springs, when somebody redid the heads, they put new springs on them because these springs are they have the correct pressures. They test the same as a brand new spring, so I know that they're not the original springs. They've been replaced. One of the things that happens though is we have to, when we cut the valves and the seats here, the spring has to sit at the correct height on the head. So when we machine material off of the valve and off of the seat, what that does is it takes material off down here. So it makes the valve sit deeper into the head, which in turn, if we go to the other side here, it makes the tip of the valve taller. And it also makes the location of the retainer, what it does is it raises this. And so it actually raises slightly where the retainer is, and it raises the spring and makes the spring too weak. So what we have to do is we have to measure to make sure that our installed height, what we call our installed height, is correct. And the way that we do that is we have a tool. This is an installed height gauge, and you read this thing just like a micrometer here. The retainer goes on top, and then it sits, this takes the place of the valve spring, and that way we can measure our height. So we go ahead and we put this down over the valves, the retainer like that. We put our retainer on there, we put our keepers in there, and then we run that out and we check it. We've already checked all of these, and what we discovered is we need a 60,000 shim on each one of them. This is probably the second time these seats have been cut, so we need to put a 60,000 shim underneath. Now these heads already have a spring cup or a pad from the factory. That's what goes on there from the factory. So, and then we need to add a shim, a 60,000 shim, which goes right over just like that. And now our spring pressure is going to be right where we need it when we assemble these heads, and that's how we're going to do it. Also on the valves, now we've checked all these and we discovered, so we've got 60 shims set aside for all of them. Another real important thing is when you install valves into the head, you never want to put these stems in dry. We always want to lube them up and put some oil in there. So I just take motor oil and put the valve stem in it. So we've got good oil on there. We want some lube on there. And then we just gently slide each valve in like so, and then we're ready to assemble it. It's okay to be generous with that oil. We want to make sure that those are lubed up really good. Some springs are directional. Keep in mind that the springs on this head are directional. If you look at the space between this coil here, this coil here, and these two, the coils down here are a lot closer together. The closer spaced coils go down to the bottom of the head. So this is going to go down here. So we're going to put our shims on first. Put your factory shim on there, and then we're going to go ahead and put our 60,000 shim on top of that to make sure that our installed height is correct. The valves are lubricated, shims are on, and then we put our umbrella seals on. They just slide right over, just like that. Then we take our springs and our retainers and we install them. We just carefully take our spring, place it over there, and we put our compressor on it, and then we basically just put this thing together. Now keep in mind on the intake, we're going to put our O-ring seal on there. So you compress the spring, then the O-ring seal goes on, and then your keepers. You got to make sure you compress the spring before you put that O-ring on. That's pretty important. And then you just repeat that for the rest of the valves. I won't insult your intelligence by making you watch me put one of these on. I think you got the gist of it. So once we get these together, we'll be back and we'll continue on. All right, guys, well, that's going to do it for the 305 GMC V6 build. I know I said I was going to put the heads on, but this video turned out to be longer than I thought. So in the very next segment, we're going to be installing the heads and doing a bunch of stuff to button up that 305 V6. Thanks for watching. Make sure you support this channel at www.patreon.com/myvintageiron7512. The address is down there. Make a monthly pledge and we'll do some really cool builds. And also subscribe to my channel, and I will talk to you very soon, I promise.